Before we begin tonight's story, let me ask you something. What would you do if you were the only person alive who knew the truth, and the most dangerous man in the city walked through the door to make sure that truth was buried with you? That's the question one woman is about to answer. Alone. At 3 in the morning. In a freezing morgue at the edge of a snowbound city with a dead body on the table and a killer's secret hidden inside it. Her name is Eve. She doesn't beg. She doesn't break. And she's about to read a corpse so carefully that she uncovers a betrayal big enough to topple an empire and falls for the one man she was never supposed to survive. So get comfortable, turn the lights down. And if you love dark, slow-burn Mafia romance, the kind with obsession, danger, forbidden love, and a twist you will not see coming, then you're in exactly the right place. Before we start, do me one small favor, tap that like button and subscribe, because stories like this one take everything we've got to make, and there's a moment near the end that's going to wreck you. Trust me. Ready? The snow is already falling. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Body That Lied. The snow came down over Boston like it meant to bury something. By 2 in the morning, the city had surrendered to it. The streets around the medical examiner's office had gone white and silent. The kind of silence that presses on the ears, and inside the building, only one set of lights still burned. The cold blue lights of the autopsy suite where Dr. Eve Marlowe stood alone with the dead. She preferred them this way. The dead never lowered their voices when she walked into a room. They never stopped talking and started watching the way the living did, the way her colleagues did when she passed them in the hall, that small practiced silence, the glance that said, "There's the strange one, the one who eats lunch over a talk screen, the one who never laughs." Eve had stopped minding it years ago. Or she had told herself she'd stopped, which in her experience came to nearly the same thing. The body had arrived at 1:40 a.m., with no name and a number tagged as a probable overdose recovered from a car gone off the road near the harbor. Single occupant. Female. Mid-30s. The intake notes were 3 lines long and bored, the way intake notes always were when someone had decided in advance what the answer would be. Eve read those 3 lines, and something in her went very still. She had learned in a life that had taught her almost nothing gently to trust that stillness. It was the same feeling she'd had as a girl in a house. She no longer let herself remember the animal certainty that the story she was being told and the truth in the room were not the same thing. She pulled on her gloves, snapped them at the wrist, and began to listen to the body. The woman on her table was beautiful in the particular way of people who had been powerful in life. Good bones, a fighter's hands, a small gold cross at the throat worth more than Eve's car. And there, below the left collarbone, half hidden by the line of the autopsy sheet, a tattoo. Not decorative. A coiled serpent around a single thorned rose, the ink old and deliberate. Eve had seen that mark twice before. Both times on bodies the city had been very eager to file and forget. She knew whose mark it was. Everyone in Boston who worked downstream of the violent dead knew. The Vitale family did not bury their own quietly. So the fact that someone had tried to file this woman as a nameless overdose meant that someone had wanted her gone in a way the family itself did not yet understand. Eve worked slowly, methodically, the way she did everything. And the body told her its story line by line, the way bodies always did if you had the patience to let them. The overdose was a lie. There was a single injection site at the inside of the right elbow, but the angle was wrong, too steep. The bruising suggesting the needle had gone in while the woman was being held still. The petechia in her eyes told one tale. The faint, fading marks at her throat told another. And beneath her fingernails, where a frightened, dying woman claws at whatever is closest, Eve found fibers. Black wool. Expensive. This woman had been strangled. Sedated first, then strangled. Then arranged in a car and driven off a road into the snow so the city would write her death in 3 board lines and move on. Eve straightened. The blue lights hummed. The snow ticked against the high windows. And somewhere beneath her professional calm in the place she did not visit, something old and cold whispered, "Whoever did this is going to want the body to disappear before anyone reads it the way you just did." She was reaching for the recorder to log her findings when she heard it. Footsteps in the dead building. Unhurried, heavy with snow, coming toward the one room with a light on. Eve did not run. Running had never once in her life made her safer. It had only made her easier to catch. So she did the thing that had kept her alive when she was small and the world was large and cruel. She stood very still, lowered her hands to her sides and turned to face the door. It opened. A man filled the frame, and the cold came in with him. He was tall, dressed in black, his long coat dusted white across the shoulders from the storm he'd walked through to get here. He did not look like a man who had ever walked anywhere he wasn't certain of. Snow melted in his dark hair. His face was beautiful and terrible, and absolutely without warmth. The face of someone who had stopped expecting the world to give him anything and had simply started taking. His eyes found the body first. Just for a moment, something moved behind them, fast and gone like a fish under ice. Then his eyes found her. And Eve, who had taught herself to read the dead, read the living man in the doorway in a single breath. He came here to make this body disappear, and he just realized, I've already seen everything it had to say. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Two strangers, a steel table between them, a murdered woman lying open to the truth, and the snow falling and falling outside as if the whole city were holding its breath. "You're not supposed to be here," the man said. His voice was quiet, calm, the calm of deep water. "Neither are you," said Eve. The corner of his mouth did something that on another man might have become a smile. She would learn later that his name was Damiano Vitale, that he held a city in his fist, that grown men with reputations of their own went pale when his car pulled up outside their door, that he had come to the morgue at 3 a.m. to quietly erase the death of a woman he loved. But in that first moment, she knew none of it. She knew only that the most dangerous man she had ever seen was standing in her morgue, and that she was the only person in Boston who could prove the lie about the body between them. And she did not beg. That, more than anything, was what undid him. Chapter 2, The One Who Didn't Beg. He crossed the room slowly, and Eve made herself stay where she was. Up close, he was worse or better, depending on how you measured such things. There was a stillness to him that had nothing to do with peace. He came to the edge of the table and looked down at the dead woman with an expression Eve could not name, and his gloved hand rose as if to touch her face, then stopped hovering and lowered again. Black wool gloves, Eve noticed, the same as the fibers under the victim's nails, but not torn, not his. "What did you find?" he said. It was not a question. It was an order shaped like one. "You first," Eve said. "Who is she?" His eyes lifted to hers, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. People did not, she gathered, ask Damiano Vitale to go first. People did not ask him for anything. They simply hoped very hard that he would not notice them. "You don't understand the situation you're in," he said. "I understand it perfectly." Eve held up her hands, both gloves rust dark to the wrist with the woman's blood. She did not lower them. "You came here to take a body that's already been read. You can take it. You can take the recorder. You can take me. But the autopsy happened. Her cells already told me what was done to her, and you can't unmake that by removing the evidence any more than you can unburn a letter by hiding the ashes." She met his eyes. She was strangled, after she was sedated, by someone wearing gloves exactly like the ones you have on. And then someone tried to convince the city she put a needle in her own arm and drove into the sea. The silence that followed had weight. She watched it move through him, not surprise exactly. Confirmation. As if she had said aloud a thing he had walked through the snow already half knowing. "Say her name was nothing to you," he said softly. "Say I let you walk out of here tonight. What happens tomorrow?" "Tomorrow I file what I found because that's the job. And the job is the only thing I've ever been able to trust." Eve's voice did not shake. She had not let her voice shake in 15 years. "You can kill me to stop the file, but you came here in person in a storm instead of sending men. Which means whatever this is, you don't trust your own house with it. Which means you have a problem much larger than one pathologist." She lowered her hands at last, slowly, deliberately. "And I think you already know I'm the only one who's read her honestly." He studied her for a long, long moment. Most people looked at like that found somewhere else to put their eyes. Eve did not. She had been looked at by worse than him, by men whose names she had spent a lifetime trying to forget, and she had learned that the only thing more dangerous than a predator was letting it know you'd seen yourself as prey. "You should be afraid of me," he said, almost curious now. "I've been afraid of worse," said Eve. "It's overrated." And there finally, something cracked across his face. Not warmth, not yet, but a kind of dark fascination, the look of a man who has reached into cold water, expecting nothing, and felt a current pull back. He did not take the body that night. He took the recorder. He took her name off the intake log, with a single phone call that someone somewhere answered on the first ring at 3 in the morning. And then he looked at Eve Marlowe across the body of the woman she now suspected he had loved, and made a decision she would not understand for weeks. "You found the truth no one else could find," he said. "So now you belong to it. and it belongs to me." He stepped back toward the door and the snow light caught the side of his face. "You'll be watched, Dr. Marlowe. Not because I think you'll run, because I think you won't. And that," he said with something almost like regret, "is the part I can't allow myself to like." He left. The door swung shut. The snow ticked at the glass. Eve stood alone with the dead woman, and her blood-stained gloves, and the slow, certain knowledge that her life, the small, locked, careful life she had built like a fortress around the girl she used to be, had just ended, and that against every instinct she had spent a lifetime sharpening, she was not afraid. She should have been. She knew she should have been. She lifted one glove to her face, breathed in the iron of it, and admitted the truth only to the dead who could keep it. She felt awake for the first time in years. Chapter 3. Forced proximity. They came for her the next evening and they were polite about it, which was somehow worse. Two men in dark suits, courteous as funeral directors, waiting beside a black SUV outside her apartment as the snow turned the streetlights into halos. "Mr. Vitali would like to ensure your safety, Doctor." As if she had a choice. As if the word "like" meant anything in a sentence that ended with "men built like doors." Eve packed a single bag. She had learned long ago to keep her life small enough to carry. Then she got in the car. They did not take her to a cell. They took her to the top of the city. The Vitale residence occupied the highest floors of a tower over the harbor, all black glass and cold light, the kind of place that did not so much display wealth as hold it the way a vault holds silence. From the windows, the storm looked like something happening to other people far below. Eve stood at the glass with her coat still on, and watched the snow fall on a Boston that had never once been kind to her, and felt the strange vertigo of being lifted suddenly above her own life. "You'll have the east rooms," Damiano said behind her. She hadn't heard him come in. She suspected no one ever did. "And the cameras?" she asked without turning. "Everywhere but where you sleep." A pause. "I'm a criminal, Dr. Marlowe, not an animal. The men I'm afraid of always said they were one but not the other." She turned then and met his eyes across the dim, beautiful room. It was never true. Something flickered in him. He filed it away. She could see him do it. This man who filed everything, who collected the small involuntary truths people dropped, the way other men collected debts. "Why am I still alive?" she said, not pleading, just wanting the shape of it. He considered her for a long moment, the city burning cold behind him. "Because every person I have ever kept close eventually begs me for something," he said. "Their life, their family, forgiveness, a way out. I've come to understand a man by what the people around him want from him." He stepped closer, and the air seemed to thin. "You want nothing from me. You've wanted nothing since the moment I walked into that room. I find I can't stop thinking about why. And you think keeping me here will tell you. I think," he said softly, "that you are the only honest thing left in my world, and I have spent my entire life learning that the honest things are the ones you can't afford to let out of your sight." He left her at the glass, and Eve, alone in a fortress in the sky, understood the trap precisely. He had not imprisoned her to control the evidence. The evidence was a pretext he half believed. He had pulled her close because she was a riddle, and Damiano Vitali had spent so long solving the worst of men that he no longer knew how to leave a mystery alone. The most dangerous thing about him, she realized, was not that he wanted to kill her. It was that he wanted to understand her. And no one, not in 15 years, not since the night she'd climbed out a window into the dark and run until the world stopped being a cage, had ever truly wanted to do that. That first week was a war fought in inches. She learned the house. She learned its people, the silent staff, the rotating guards, the cold, beautiful rooms that no one seemed to live in. And she learned him in fragments, the way you learn weather. He did not eat with anyone. He worked at all hours. He came back some nights with a stillness on him that was somehow louder than rage, and on those nights the whole house seemed to lower its voice. Once, she passed the open door of his study and saw him standing at the window in the dark, unmoving, a glass, untouched, in his hand, and she understood without being told that he was grieving the woman on her table, and that he could not afford to let a single soul in his organization see him do it. That was the night she stopped thinking of him only as a danger. "You loved her," Eve said from the doorway. He did not turn. For a long time he said nothing, and she thought he wouldn't. "Gabriella," he said at last. The name came out of him like something pulled from deep water. "My cousin, my blood, the only person in 20 years I never had to watch." He turned, and his face in the dark was terrible and human at once. I built everything I have on the certainty that I could trust exactly one person in the world. And someone in my own house put their hands around her throat and threw her into the sea and dressed it up so the city would yawn and file it away. His voice did not rise. That was the worst of it. You read her right, Dr. Marlowe, when my own men read her wrong. So tell me what you see, because I can no longer trust my own eyes in this house. And Eve, who trusted no one, found herself crossing the room to stand beside the most dangerous man in Boston and tell him the truth. The fibers under her nails were black wool, expensive, the kind in a tailored coat, not a street coat. The sedative was clinical, not recreational. Whoever did this had medical access or medical knowledge, and the injection was staged by someone who knew what an overdose looks like on paper but had never actually watched one happen because they got the angle wrong. She paused. She wasn't killed by an enemy outside your walls, Mr. Vitali. She was killed by someone inside them. Someone who could get close enough to hold her still. Someone she didn't think she had to fear. The silence that followed was absolute. When he finally looked at her, something in his face had changed for good. I have spent my whole life, he said, very quietly, surrounded by people who tell me what they think will keep them alive. He looked at her like a man looking at the first clean water after a long thirst. You tell me what's true even when it might get you killed. I don't know what to do with that. Most people don't, said Eve. She did not tell him that her honesty was not courage, that it was the only thing she'd been able to keep from the wreckage of her childhood, the one possession no one had ever managed to take from her, and that she clung to it the way a drowning person clings to the single board that floats. She did not tell him that the reason she didn't fear death was that she had already survived something that felt at the time exactly like dying. She would tell him eventually, but not yet. Chapter 4: The House of Knives. The Vitali family was a kingdom, and like all kingdoms, it was full of men waiting for the throne. Eve learned them slowly from the high, cold rooms where she was kept. She learned them the way she learned bodies, by what they revealed when they thought no one was reading. There was Tommaso, old and loyal and grieving, who had served Damiano's father and looked at the young boss with the wary love of a man watching the last of a line. There were the soldiers, hard and uncomplicated, and there was Lorenzo Bracco, the underboss, and from the first time Eve saw him, she felt the small, cold stillness that had never once in her life lied to her. Lorenzo smiled. That was the thing about him. He smiled like a man who had decided long ago that a smile was the most useful weapon in any room, and had practiced until it cost him nothing. He was handsome in a polished, patient way. He called Damiano brother and touched his shoulder when he said it. He brought Eve a coffee once unasked and said how good it was that the boss had found someone to keep him steady in a hard season, and his eyes the whole time were doing inventory. He doesn't like that I'm here, Eve told Damiano that night. Lorenzo doesn't like anything he didn't arrange, Damiano said. It's why he's useful. He sees angles. A pause. He's been with me 12 years. He held the family together while I was away burying my father. There is no one I trust more with the business. The business, Eve noted. Not with my life. Not with Gabriella. She said nothing. But she began quietly to watch Lorenzo Bracco the way she watched a talk screen that didn't add up. Because here was the thing the body had told her, the thing she had not yet said aloud, even to Damiano. Whoever killed Gabriella had needed 3 things. Medical knowledge to stage the overdose, closeness to get within arm's reach of a careful woman, and reason, because no one strangles the most trusted blood of the most dangerous man in Boston unless killing her gains them something enormous. Gabriella, Eve had learned by then, had not merely been Damiano's cousin. She had been his consigliere in all but name. The one who knew where the money slept. The one who would have inherited a great deal of power if Damiano ever fell, and who stood alive directly between any ambitious man and the top of the house. Remove Gabriella, and the path to the throne grew one body shorter. Eve had no proof. She had a pattern, but she had learned in a childhood spent reading the moods of dangerous men to know when to hide, that the pattern came first, and the proof came after, and that the people who waited for proof before they believed the pattern were the people who didn't survive. She kept her suspicion folded small and close, and she watched Lorenzo smile, and she waited. Chapter 5: The Slow Burn. Something was happening between her and Damiano, and they were both too disciplined to name it. It happened in the spaces between words, in the way he began to come to the east rooms in the small hours ostensibly to ask about the case, and stayed long after the case was exhausted. the two of them at the great cold windows watching the harbor lights, saying less and less, and meaning more and more. It happened the night he found her unable to sleep and did not ask why, but simply stood with her in the dark. And when her hand was resting on the glass beside his, he moved his half an inch no more, until the side of his hand touched the side of hers, and neither of them looked down and neither of them moved away, and the whole world narrowed to that one point of warmth in a fortress made of ice. It happened in the things he did not do. He never touched her without a reason. He never used the power he had over her, and he had all of it. She was by any honest accounting his prisoner. He could have done anything. He did nothing, and the restraint in him, the deliberate held-back force of a man who took whatever he wanted from the world, choosing not to take from her, was more intimate than anything he could have said. "Why do you hold yourself like that?" she asked him once in the dark. "Like you're afraid of how much room you'd take up if you let go." He was quiet for a long time. "When I was 19, he said, I learned that the people closest to me are the ones who pay for what I want. So I stopped wanting things where anyone could see." He looked at her. "It's safer for the thing not to be wanted by me. You should know that. You especially. And do you want me?" Eve said. Not coy, just direct the way she was direct about everything. The silence stretched until it nearly broke. "I want," he said, finally carefully, "to never again walk into a room and find the one honest person in my life on a steel table. That's as close to an answer as I can give you and still keep you safe." It was the most frightened she had ever seen him, and she understood standing there that the danger had reversed itself somewhere along the way. She had walked into this fortress as a woman who could prove a truth he needed buried. She was becoming a woman whose death he could not survive. And a man like Damiano Vitali, who had built an empire on caring about exactly one person and had just watched that person murdered, that man could not afford to care about anyone. Least of all, her least of all now. She saw him understand it too. She saw the denial come down over him like a shutter. He stepped back from the window from her, his face going cold and controlled again, the boss reassembling himself out of the man. "You should sleep," he said. But he sat outside her door that night. She knew because she heard the chair scrape, and in the morning it was still there, angled toward the city where he had kept watch over a woman he was trying very hard not to love. Chapter 6. Black SUVs in the snow. They came for her on a Thursday. She was being driven back from the medical examiner's office Damiano had with great reluctance, and 3 armed men allowed her to continue her work because Eve Marlowe without her work was a caged thing, and he had recognized that the way he recognized everything instantly. And without comment. The snow had started again. The harbor was a smear of gray, and on a narrow street between 2 buildings, a second car slid out of an alley and stopped dead in front of theirs, and the world came apart. She would remember it always in fragments. The crunch of metal, the shouts, the flat, obscene crack of gunfire that sounded nothing like the movies, smaller and worse. Glass becoming a held breath, and then a scream. Her guard in the front seat going suddenly terribly still. And then the door beside her was torn open, and Damiano was there. She never learned how he'd known. He'd had a second car behind them. He always had a second car, a second plan, a second knife. And at the first wrong movement of the street, he had been out of it and running through the gunfire toward her. And now his body was over hers, his arms around her head, his back to the shattered window and the men trying to put rounds through it. And he was using himself, the most valuable life in Boston, as a wall between her and the dark. "Stay down," he said into her hair. "Calm. Even now, I have you." The world went very loud and then very quiet. His men ended it the way his men ended things. And then there was only the falling snow and the steam rising off the ruined cars, and Damiano Vitali kneeling in the broken glass with his arms still around her, blood on his sleeve. That was not his heart slamming against her where it was pressed to his chest. The only part of him that betrayed. How afraid he had been. "You're shaking," she said. "You almost died," he said, "because of me." "People have tried to kill me before," Eve said, and felt him go still. He pulled back and looked at her, snow catching in his dark hair, his face open in a way she had never seen it. "Who?" he said. "Just that. Who?" And there was something in the word that made her understand. He would find them, whoever they were. All of them. Anyone who had ever raised a hand to her. And that he would do it not as a boss settling business, but as a man undone. "Later," she said softly. "Right now you're bleeding." He wasn't. The blood was his guard's, but she needed him to look down, to break the terrible openness of that gaze, because she could feel the locked rooms inside her beginning to come unlatched, and she was not ready. She was not ready for anyone to see what was behind those doors. He carried her to the car anyway. She told him she could walk and he ignored her, and she let him just that once. Let herself be carried through the snow, in the arms of a man covered in someone else's blood, her face against his neck, both of them alive and shaking, refusing to say the thing that had nearly been said too late. That night, she understood two things with total clarity. The first was that the attack had not come from outside the family. It had been too precise. Someone had known her route. Someone inside the house had wanted Eve Marlowe dead because Eve Marlowe was the only person alive who could prove Gabriella was murdered, and was getting closer every day to proving who. The second was that she was in love with him, helplessly. The way you fall through ice. No decision in it, just the sudden cold and the closing dark and the strange, terrible peace of it. Both of those things she knew would get her killed. She decided she didn't care. That was new. That was the most dangerous thing that had happened to her in 15 years. More dangerous than the gunfire. More dangerous than the man. For the first time since she was a frightened girl climbing out a window into the dark, Eve Marlowe had found something she was unwilling to survive the loss of. Chapter 7. The past she escaped. He came to her rooms that night, and this time he did not pretend it was about the case. You said people have tried to kill you before. He stood just inside the door, the bloodied shirt changed his hands very still at his sides. I need you to tell me, not as the man keeping you here. As he started again lower. I need to know what made you, because every person I've ever met is afraid of dying and you aren't, and I can't protect you from a thing I don't understand. So she told him. She had never told anyone. She had built her whole adult life on never telling anyone, on being the cold one, the strange one, the one who lived alone with the dead, because the dead never asked. But she stood at the window with her back to him because she could not say it to his face, and she told him. She told him about the house she'd grown up in that had not been a home, about the man who had run it. Not a father, though he'd made the children call him one and the others he'd brought through, and the things that had been done in those rooms and the way she had learned to read a grown man's mood. Across a room so she would know which nights to make herself small and which nights to disappear entirely. She told him how she had taught herself at 9 to feel nothing, because feeling was a luxury that got girls hurt. She told him about the window and the night she'd finally gone through it 15 years old into a winter exactly like this one, and run until the house was a memory, and the girl she'd been was a body she'd left behind. I don't fear death, she said to the glass, to the falling snow, because I already died once. The girl in that house died the night she climbed out the window. Everything since has been extra, borrowed. You can't threaten a person with the loss of a life she never expected to have. She wrapped her arms around herself. That's the thing you couldn't understand. That's why I didn't beg. There was nothing left in me that believed it was owed anything. The silence behind her was so complete she thought for a moment that he had gone. Then she felt him, not touching her, standing close enough that his warmth reached her, his presence, a wall at her back exactly as it had been in the broken car. And when he spoke, his voice was different than she had ever heard it. Stripped low, almost broken. They're all dead, he said. Whoever they were. By the time the sun comes up, if you give me the name of that house, every man who was ever in it is dead, and it will look like nothing and no one will ever ask. I know, Eve whispered. That's why I'm not going to give you the name. She turned finally to face him. I didn't tell you so you could kill them. I told you because you asked who made me, and the answer is that I made me. In the dark, out a window, with no one's help. And I have spent 15 years believing that no one was ever going to want to know the girl who came through that window. Her voice did not shake. She would not let it shake. And then you asked. He looked at her like a man looking at something he had no right to. I'm the worst thing that could happen to you, he said. You understand that. I am death with a good coat on. Everyone I keep close I bury. I should put you on a plane tonight and burn this whole house down before it takes you too. Probably Eve agreed. Then tell me to, he said, almost desperate. Tell me to send you away. I'll do it. I've never been able to do the merciful thing in my life, but I think I could do it for you. Tell me to let you go. And Eve Marlowe, who had spent 15 years letting go of everything before it could be taken from her, stepped forward across the small, cold distance between them, took the lapels of his coat in both her hands and said no. He kissed her like a man going under for the last time. There was nothing gentle in it and nothing cruel either. Only the terrible relief of two people who had been holding themselves apart from the whole world. Finally, letting go. Just once. Just here in a fortress in the sky, with the snow erasing. The city below. His hands came up to frame her face, like she was something that could break this man who broke everything, and she felt the held-back force of him trembling with restraint. Even now, even in this, and she pulled him closer to tell him without words that she did not want him to hold back. Not from her, never from her. When they finally drew apart, he pressed his forehead to hers and breathed like a man who had run a long way. "This is going to get you killed," he said. "Then it gets me killed," said Eve, "but I'll have been alive first. That's more than I ever planned on." Outside, the snow came down and down over a city that had no idea its most feared man had just finally, after a lifetime of careful nothing, allowed himself to want one true thing. Chapter 8. The Trap She Built. In the morning, Eve became dangerous on purpose. She had the pattern, she had the means, the access, the motive, all of it pointing at one smiling man. What she did not have was proof a court of Mafia justice would accept, because the only proof was a confession, and men like Lorenzo Bracco did not confess. They smiled and waited and let other people die to clear their path, and walked into the throne room with clean hands. So Eve decided to make him need to lie. She went back to the body Gabriella kept on ice in a private facility Damiano had arranged because he could not bring himself to release her, could not let her be buried until the truth that killed her was answered. Eve ran the analyses again properly, this time with real equipment and real time, and she built carefully a lie inside the truth. She drafted a forensic report. It was nearly all accurate, but she altered one detail deliberately. Surgically, she wrote that a partial DNA profile had been recovered from beneath the victim's nails, skin cells from the killer, scratched loose in the struggle. She wrote that the profile was degraded but viable. She wrote that with a comparison sample, an identification could be made with near certainty. It was a lie. There had been fibers under Gabriella's nails. There had been no usable skin, no salvageable profile of the killer. But Lorenzo did not know that. And a man who has strangled someone and only later learns that the dying woman's fingers were full of his own cells, that man does something. He cannot help it. He moves. She let the report be found. She did it cleanly. She mentioned in front of Tommaso that she'd recovered something significant and would present it to the boss in 2 days. She let the words travel the way words travel in a house full of frightened, listening men. And then she waited and watched Lorenzo Bracco and counted the seconds until the smile slipped. It slipped that evening. She caught it across a room, a flicker, a half-second, when the patient mask came loose and something cold and calculating looked out straight at her, and then the smile slid back into place. He came to her afterward, casual, warm, and asked with great kindness how the analysis was going, whether forensics was ever truly certain, whether a degraded sample could really be trusted. And Eve said pleasantly that this one could, that it was only a matter of getting a comparison from the right person. She watched him understand that the right person was him, and she watched him decide what he had decided about Gabriella, about the guard who died in the broken car, about everyone who stood between Lorenzo Bracco and the chair at the head of the table, that the simplest solution to a witness was a dead witness, which was exactly what she wanted, because the report had a second lie in it, smaller and crueler than the first. She had written that the comparison sample would be collected and the identification finalized in the boss's study at 9 o'clock 2 nights hence. She had set a time and a place. She had built a room and baited it and put herself in the center of it, and she had not told Damiano any of it because Damiano, who loved her now and could not hide it, would never have let her be the bait. He would have moved too soon, too hard, and Lorenzo would have smiled and slipped the noose, and the truth about Gabriella would have stayed buried forever under that beautiful, patient face. She loved Damiano too much to let him protect her into failure. So she lied to him too. Just once. Just enough. And she walked into the trap she'd built with her eyes open, because she had spent her whole life being the prey in someone else's room, and just this once she was going to be the one who'd set it. Chapter 9. The Confession. 9 o'clock. The boss's study. The snow falling past the black glass like static. Eve stood by the desk with the forensic file in her hands. Damiano sat in the great chair, watchful, sensing something wrong in the air the way he sensed everything. His eyes on her, asking a silent question she did not answer. She had told him only that she would present her findings tonight here, and that he should let her speak no matter what was said. He had not liked it. He had agreed because by now he trusted her honesty more than his own instincts. And the trust was the last piece she'd needed. Lorenzo came at 9:05. He came alone, smiling, brother. And he came because a man who believes there is DNA evidence cannot stay away from the room where it will be revealed. He has to be there, has to see it, has to be close enough to act, if action is required. "I hear we finally have an answer," Lorenzo said, warmly settling into a chair. "About Gabriella. God rest her. It's been eating the whole house alive, not knowing. We have an answer." Eve agreed. She opened the file, and she began to lie with absolute surgical calm. She walked them through it. The fibers, the sedative, the staging, and then the partial profile degraded, she said, but viable, recovered from beneath the victim's nails, skin cells from the man who had held her down. She watched Lorenzo's face the whole time. She watched the smile hold. She had to break it. She had one more card, and she played it. "The profile's only a partial," Eve said almost apologetically. "On its own, it would never hold. But there's a second finding." She let the silence stretch. "I ran the victim's full genetic markers as a control, and the system flagged a familial match in the comparison database. A close one, first degree." She looked up directly at Lorenzo. Gabriella had a sibling no one knew about. A sister. And that sister's profile is in the system because she works in forensics. The match came back to me. The room went absolutely silent. Eve felt the floor tilt under her own feet. She had written that detail as the final irresistible bait, a lie so strange and specific that Lorenzo would be too rattled to think clearly, would be certain the evidence was real, because who would invent something so insane? She had invented it. She had pulled it out of the air to break his composure. She did not yet know it was true. But it worked. Oh, it worked. Because Lorenzo Bracco's smile finally fully fell, not at the word sister, which meant nothing to him, but at everything. It implied that the science was real, that the evidence was real, that the degraded profile under those nails was real, that everything he'd believed safely drowned in the harbor had clawed its way back up onto this desk, in a folder that the woman in front of him could put his skin cells inside a dead woman's hands. "That's not possible," Lorenzo said. Quiet now. The warmth gone. There was nothing under her nails. "I checked. The room stopped breathing." He heard himself say it a half-second too late. Damiano had not moved. He sat in the great chair, perfectly still, and only his eyes had changed, gone flat and black and final, the eyes of a man who has just heard the last thing he will ever need to hear. "You checked," Damiano said softly. Lorenzo's hand moved toward his coat. He was fast. He had always been fast. But Eve had built this room, and she had built it knowing exactly what would happen in the half-second after the mask fell, and Damiano's men were already through the doors. He'd had them waiting the moment he'd felt the wrongness in the air. Trusting her, following her into the dark, and Lorenzo Bracco was on his knees before his hand ever reached the gun. The smile, a smear now. The patience, a ruin. 12 years, Damiano said. He rose from the chair slowly. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. That was the most frightening thing about him. "I gave you my back 12 years. I let you stand at my shoulder. And you put your hands around the throat of the only blood I had left, and you smiled at me at her empty chair." He crossed the room and crouched down so they were eye to eye, the boss and the man who would have been king. "Why? Because you were never going to die," Lorenzo spat, all the smiling patience burning off him at once. "You don't take risks. You don't trust. You'd have sat in that chair for 40 years and handed it to her when you went to Gabriella, to a woman, and the rest of us would have grown old waiting for our turn at a table we built. I did what any of them were too afraid to do. I made room." His lip curled. "She didn't even fight. She trusted me. Right up to the end, she trusted me. And now Damiano said so did I." He did not do it in front of Eve. Whatever was done to Lorenzo Bracco was done elsewhere in the cold parts of the house. She was never shown, and she did not ask, and she did not pretend it troubled her conscience the way it should have, because she had learned long ago that the world was not divided into the guilty and the innocent, but into the people who had hurt her and the people who hadn't. And she had stopped a long time ago mourning the former. But before they took him out, Lorenzo looked at her Eve, the strange, cold pathologist, who had built a room and put herself in the center of it and broken him with a lie about a sister, and he laughed a small, ugly laugh. "You don't even know what you are, do you?" he said. "You don't even know what you walked into." She didn't understand him. Not yet. Chapter 10. The Truth in the Blood. It was Damiano who insisted she run it for real. "You invented the sister," he said late that night, the house finally quiet. Lorenzo's confession still hanging in the air between them like smoke. "To break him. I understand why. But you said it like..." He stopped, looked at her strangely. "You went pale when you said it, Eve. You felt it. I've watched you lie for 2 days without a flicker, and that one cost you something." "Why? It was a story," she said. "I made it up. Gabriella having a hidden sister in forensics, it was absurd enough that he'd believe the science was real." "Run it," Damiano said quietly. "The real comparison. You have her samples. You have yours in the system. Run it and prove it was a lie, and we'll never speak of it again." She didn't want to. She would think about that later, how hard her hands had not wanted to do it. How some animal part of her had already known the way she always knew, the way she'd known a murdered woman from 3 board lines of intake. But she did it, because she was Eve Marlowe, and the one thing she had never been able to do in 15 years was choose comfort over the truth. She ran Gabriella Vitale's genetic profile against her own. She watched the markers come up. One column, then the next. She had built her whole life on reading what bodies said and refusing to look away from it, and now her own blood was speaking, and there was nowhere to look that wasn't the truth. First degree relationship. Full siblings. The probability so high it rounded for all human purposes to certainty. Eve sat down on the cold floor of the lab very slowly, the printout in her hands, and for the first time in 15 years, not in the broken car, not in the dark house, not out the window into the snow, Eve Marlowe wept. Gabriella Vitale was her sister, the woman on her table. The murdered woman she had read so coldly, so professionally, line by line, naming each violence done to a body she did not know was her own blood. The careful, dangerous, beloved woman Damiano had grieved at the dark window. Eve's sister who had grown up inside a family of knives and become a power in it, while a few miles and a lifetime away, Eve had grown up in a house with no name, and climbed out a window into the cold, and learned to feel nothing. 2 girls separated so young that neither had ever known the other existed, taken in different directions by the same indifferent world. She understood now the house she had escaped. She had never let herself wonder how she'd come to be there. Children in those places came from somewhere, were taken from somewhere, were sold and lost and erased somewhere. She had buried the question with everything else she'd left behind the window, and the answer had been lying on her own table under her own gloves, wearing a serpent and a thorned rose over the heart they had, it turned out, shared the blood of. Lorenzo had known. Somehow at the end he had known or guessed. You don't even know what you walked into. The Vitale family kept records of everything. Somewhere in their long memory was the story of 2 daughters lost to the world, and a man had used it as a knife and died with it on his lips. Damiano found her on the floor of the lab an hour later, the printout crushed against her chest, and he did not ask. He read it in her face, the way she read everything in his, and his beautiful, terrible composure broke finally all the way, because he understood at last what he had been keeping close. Not a witness, not a riddle, not even only the woman he loved, the last of Gabriella, the last of his blood wearing a stranger's name that the same cruel current that had taken everything from him had washed up onto a steel table in a storm and into his life. He knelt down on the cold floor and gathered her in, and the most feared man in Boston held the sister of the woman he'd lost while she shook apart in his arms, and neither of them said anything at all because there were no words built for it. And the snow fell past the high windows over a city that knew none of it and never would. Chapter 11. What the living keep. They buried Gabriella in the spring when the snow finally let the ground go. Damiano had refused to lay her down until the truth was answered, and now it was every part of it, including the part no one had gone looking for, and so they buried her properly at last in the family ground above the harbor with the city laid out below, and the gulls turning in a sky that had finally gone soft. Eve stood beside the grave of a sister she had met only once on a steel table in the cold, and she did not pretend to grieve a woman she had never known. She grieved the not knowing. She grieved the 2 girls who should have grown up in the same house, and instead grew up in none, in opposite kinds of dark. She grieved every year of every life that the world had quietly stolen and filed away in 3 board lines, the way it had nearly filed her sister's murder, the way it had nearly filed her own small, locked existence. And she let Damiano take her hand at the graveside in front of all of them. The soldiers, old Tommaso, the whole house that had learned by now exactly what the strange cold pathologist had done in the boss's study, and exactly what she was to the woman they'd lost. She let him take her hand and hold it openly. The most feared man in Boston standing at a grave with his fingers laced through hers, hiding nothing. For the first time in his life, unwilling to keep a single true thing in the dark. "You should leave," he said to her, later on the cliff above the water, the way he always said it, because some wound in him still believed that everyone he kept close would pay for it. "You should take her name and her blood somewhere I can't reach and live a long, quiet life and never see another body brought in out of the snow. I'm what killed her world. I'll be what kills yours." Eve looked at him for a long time. The wind off the harbor moved through his dark hair, and there was gray at the temple now that had not been there in winter. And his eyes held the same thing they'd held in the morgue doorway at 3 in the morning. The certainty that he did not deserve the honest thing in front of him, and the inability to let it go. "I spent 15 years, Eve said, believing I was nobody's, that I came from nowhere and belonged to no one, and that the only safe way to live was to need nothing and want nothing and feel nothing, because everything I'd ever had been taken." She stepped close to him the way she had that night in the East Rooms when she'd taken his coat in her hands and said no. "And then a body came in out of the snow, and it turned out I had a sister, and it turned out I had a—" She stopped. Started again because she was Eve Marlowe, and she did not flinch from the truth even when it was her own. "It turned out I had you. I came from somewhere. I belong to something. I am not nobody's. Do you understand what you've given me by accident? You stupid, dangerous man. You've given me back the one thing that House took. You've made me from somewhere. I'll get you killed," he said again, but it was barely a whisper now. Probably Eve said exactly as she had the first time. "But I'll have been alive. And I'll have been yours. And after a lifetime of being no one's, I find I'm not willing to die having been no one's again." She put her hand flat against his chest over the slamming heart that was the only part of him that ever told the truth without permission. "So no, Damiano. I'm not leaving. You asked me once to tell you to let me go. I told you no then, and I'm telling you no now. And I'm going to keep telling you no every time you're afraid. Which I imagine will be often, because I have read a great many men. And you are the most frightened, brave person I have ever met." He laughed a real laugh, rough and disbelieving, the first she had ever heard from him. And then he pulled her in against the wind off the harbor and held her the way he'd held her in the broken car, like a wall against the dark. Except that this time there was nothing coming. This time, it was only the two of them and the soft spring sky and the long quiet after the storm. And when he kissed her, it was not like a man going under for the last time. It was like a man at last coming up for air. Months later, on a night with no snow in it, Eve woke alone in the great dark bedroom over the harbor and found him gone. She went looking the way she'd learned to in the long winter and found him exactly where she'd found him the first time she understood. He was a man, and not only a danger at the window of his study in the dark, a glass untouched in his hand, but he was not grieving. She could see that now. She could read him as well as she read the dead. He was simply looking out at the city he held in his fist, the cold, beautiful kingdom of knives, and on his face was something she had never once seen there when she arrived. "Peace. Couldn't sleep," she said from the doorway. "I was thinking," he said, "about how you didn't beg." He turned, and the city light caught the side of his face. "Every person I have ever kept close has begged me for something. You walked into the worst night of my life holding the one truth that could have destroyed me, and you held up your bloody hands, and you didn't ask me for a single thing." He set the glass down. "Do you know what I've decided you want? Tell me," said Eve, crossing the room to him the way she always did now, closing the cold distance that had once been the whole story of them. "Nothing I can give you," he said softly, "and everything I am." He took her face in his hands gently, this man who broke everything, who had never once broken her. "You wanted the truth, only ever the truth. And the truth, Eve, the only one I have left, is that I came to that morgue to bury a secret, and instead I found the last piece of my blood and the first piece of my own, and I have not been afraid of dying since, because I finally have the one thing worth being alive for." Outside, the city burned cold and bright and dangerous below them, the way it always had, the way it always would. But the window was warm where they stood at it. The two of them, the boss and the woman who didn't beg, the girl who came through a window into the dark, and the man who walked through a storm into a morgue, both of them washed up out of the same indifferent cold, and into impossibly against everything the world had planned for them, the same small circle of light. He had come to make a body disappear. She had made him real instead. And neither of them, for the rest of the long and dangerous and luminous life they built in that fortress in the sky, ever once let the other out of their sight. Because the honest things are the ones you can't afford to lose. End. And that is where we leave them. The boss who walked through a storm to bury a secret, and the woman who refused to beg and gave him back his own heart instead. If this story moved you, if you felt that twist land the way Eve felt it on the cold floor of that lab, do me a favor, let me know. Drop a single word in the comments, sisters. I want to see who made it all the way to the end with me tonight. And while you're down there, tell me honestly, did you suspect Lorenzo from the start, or did that confession catch you off guard? I read every comment, and the best theories make my night. If you loved this one, hit that like button. It genuinely helps these stories reach more people who need a dark, beautiful escape tonight. Share it with the one friend you know is just as obsessed with Mafia romance as you are. And if you're new here, subscribe and turn on the bell, because a brand new story drops every week, and you will not want to miss what's coming. Now I want to hear from you. Which story should I write next? Vote in the comments. Mafia boss times the runaway bride who crashed his wedding to escape her own. Mafia boss times the prosecutor's daughter sent to destroy him who falls instead. Mafia boss times the pianist who saw something she was never meant to see. Or drop your own idea below. I've turned viewer ideas into full episodes before, and the next one could be yours. Thank you for spending tonight with me. Stay warm out there, keep the lights low, and I'll see you in the next story.